started some code today. Uh, yeah, and I ran into this article on Twitter, and I've been looking for reading on this sort of what I think of like an emergent area within broader applied cryptography ecosystem. And I thought this was a good reading that covered the landscape. Uh, anyway, you can get started. You can get started with Anuraj first today and go down.
Um, yeah, so the article was at least really informative for me. So I had been trying to, so when I was in this Dev Connect event, so I had uh, gone through some of the toolings they are mentioning. So, for example, there was some risk zero tooling and then some other things. So I was mainly going through the tooling and the implementation, the ASIC implementations of these. And one of the things I went through this was this circum programming language that basically converts the circuits into mathematical language. And from the first glance, it's looks really similar to some sort of a hardware description language. So hardware description language is how you make, let's say, uh, application or like CPU or some specific SOCs. So at least from the first glance, it seemed really similar to that to me, and I was mostly exploring through that. But yeah, I didn't understand much of the math they are talking about. But yeah, that is what I had to say, and that was what I found really interesting. Passing on to Ben.
Unfortunately, I arrived late today, so I haven't really finished the article. I guess I can blab a bit about abstractions, and it's an interesting idea, verifiable compute. It really, I mean, it's like zero-knowledge proofs, and then it comes down to the details. If you can get something where, like, there's some very expensive computation and then some simple proof that you did it correctly, I mean, that obviously allows easy outsourcing. Since someone can, you can pay someone to do the computation, get the result, get the proof, and that's it's basically equivalent to, assuming the proof is, correct and the math works. You doing it yourself, and you don't have to. It's much less trusting than just running it on a cloud. How you actually do that, I'm still not quite sure I understand how you actually get there. But I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, I think it's a long way from actually being practical, at least in terms of so that you can actually, hey, I have some compute that I want someone else to do. Maybe it has some AI applications in that having like verifiable training might be useful. Um, but I still think, yeah, it's about half a decade to a decade away, at least. Anyway, I think I'll move down to Grigori. I don't have much to say.
I also arrived a little bit late, maybe 7 or 8 minutes late. So I haven't finished the article properly, but I skimmed it. And I was thinking that given the constraints, namely the cost and amount of compute, probably you can do some alternative ideas, like, for example, to insert some steps into computation itself that would report something to a verifier. And based on this something that has been reported from the computation to a verifier could conclude that exactly what was supposed to happen happened. So instead of trying to verify the whole computation and invoking the costs, both in terms of time and money, it can do a little bit less than verifying the whole computation. So somehow to reduce the number of steps it needs to take. But other than that, it's an interesting overview of what is supposed to be happening in the field. And it's an important problem. What and an impressive number of companies trying to attack the problem. But as for the solution, I am not sure that current solutions described in the article will stand the test of time. And the idea that the cost will eventually go down is not a very good one, in my view, because it applies to everything, including the computation itself, the original computation itself. So it will expand the scope of the original computation to the same degree that it will drive the cost down. And we can be pretty sure about that. So we are not going to start spending less money on compute. We will be spending probably even more money on compute. At least history shows us that. And throughout the history, this relationship between time and cost standard. So the cost of compute decreased, but we are doing more of it. So in aggregate, we are spending more on it. And that's why I think relying on Moore's law in this particular case is unwise. And I will pass it on to Nathan.
So I will have to say, also bake off any sort of deep understanding of this. I think that my general thoughts kind of echo a lot of what Ben and Grigori have said. I'm very, very skeptical that the computational cost of these things is going to come down as much as the author is kind of postulating for wide scale commercial adoption. That said, I'm not sure that that is as much of a barrier because a lot of the systems we have are things that do kind of the same thing again and again and again. And it strikes me that this is the sort of technology that could very well be deployed in almost a product safety sort of way. You may not verify every computation, but you do what theoretically the TSA should be doing, but doesn't, which is you do a random sampling. And so as an attacker, you never are quite sure if you're the thing that's going to get verified or not. And obviously, the more the computational cost comes down, the more sampling you can do. But that sort of approach can give you, it's not sort of a revolution where suddenly every system becomes trusted, but it becomes another trust layer that you could add on to things. I think I agree with Ben that the AI training applications seem to be the most immediately applicable. There's been a set of papers recently about using training data to poison models in very hard to detect ways. And this would be kind of a way that you could verify that a particular model has not been poisoned during training. So I think that is, potentially as AI models become a bigger and bigger deal in society, that becomes a very important thing, particularly for highly critical applications. I also think that the composability thing may also be a bigger deal. The paper mentioned it kind of towards the end, about the idea of chaining proofs together. So you prove smaller systems, and then you can use that proof of the smaller system to prove as an input to proving a larger system. And a lot of what we do is is composed of like smaller systems interacting with each other, and particularly a lot of times smaller systems with well-defined inputs and outputs. And being able to sort of verify those kind of once, and then know that, as long as I'm within a certain operational tolerances. So we might now talk about not only operational tolerances, but verification tolerances. I've got this essentially lookup table of verifications that I can do, and it's very fast to go through that. And I can say, oh, well, as long as I'm within my verification tolerances, I know that this computational bit is performing properly. And so that's potentially kind of interesting, I think, particularly for maybe like operational technology security, things like water treatment plants and power generation and things like that, which it's hard to provide a lot of traditional security to because those systems tend to just fall over really easily. So having this sort of verification guardrails in addition to operating tolerance guardrails might be an interesting way to bypass a lot of the fragility of those systems from a security perspective. Also, it's like the resurrection of the Unix philosophy, or part of the Unix philosophy when it comes to um, larger computational systems. Rather than having monolithic applications, small pieces, loosely joined, small pieces that we can verify. I know I've talked for a lot of time, but one last thought is it also one thing I've always been a little skeptical of with a lot of the interactions between sort of blockchains and physical world has been kind of the oracle problem, and how do you trust an oracle? So it also seems like as a general class, not necessarily like ZK stuff, but like just verifiable computing as a general class of things, kind of offers an answer to the oracle problem. Like I could have attested sensors, I can do proofs that the oracle has not manipulated those inputs, and those inputs have not been manipulated since being received by the oracle. And it now creates a chain of trust between sort of sensor, whatever that is, and the blockchain. And when the question is, did a actual human do the thing? Sometimes that gets a little bit. There's still some trickiness there, but it does a lot to really cut down the oracle the oracle problem. So I think that like those would be the three sort of like most immediate things would be kind of like high trust applications, not everything, but you need an audit trail or you need to verify this. Think like security cameras, congressional testimony, that sort of thing. That sort of thing is really useful to verify. The oracle problem is really useful. High trust computation, whether that's operational technology or AI training, that's really useful. These are all much more narrow sort of things. And long term, I kind of suspect that you never see a world of everything is verified. I'm kind of with Grigori in this. Never things. I don't see this getting cheaper, at least to the magnitude that would be necessary. But I could see a world of sort of a small computational pieces loosely joined, combined with kind of randomized proving to create a much more trusting computing environment, and an environment that's much harder to bypass that trust than what we currently have. But yeah, I think I agree with Ben that particular sort of vision, even though that's much scoped back from the paper, is got to be at least a decade out, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's a couple of decades. So those are my thoughts, and I will pass down to Sachin.
Yeah, really interesting to read. Don't have much to add other than, yeah, I guess the part that stood out to me was how, like, how much the cost of like the cost of the high cost of verifying something or verifiability, I guess, compared to doing the actual calculation. And I guess interesting that it sort of like just applies to everything in general these days, like a sort of like a like bullshit is harder to disprove than produce. So it's like hard to prove the verifiability of something, and it seems like it's like a problem with everything. Like even with ChatGPT, I don't know if I was trying to get it to explain zero knowledge proofs, but I don't really know if it's accurate or not, because this is like a thing where I don't have much like intuition on figuring out if it's right or not. And yeah, that's the part that stood out to me. And yeah, it would be interesting to see sort of like real world, not just digital, but like physical use cases. I don't know. I was like thinking of like maybe there would be at a lower enough cost, you could have some sort of like ZK wiki project that covers like specific things that have sensors and stuff. For example, I think it was in like governance studies we read about how the Amazon rainforests have a lot of sensors to detect if logging is taking place. And I don't know, it would be interesting to have some sort of like ZK wiki of if it has been tampered with or something like that. But yeah, but interesting read. Venkat.
Yeah, good find, Anant. This was pretty comprehensive overview, and there were several new things for me, like the references to the old papers where all this started, which I hadn't really thought about. Like, what was the train of thought that got here? And kind of makes sense that it starts somewhere in computational complexity and the cost of verifying in the P versus NP sense, and the idea that I lost my train of thought there. But yeah, so the details, I think it's not an accident that none of us have been able to dive deep. Like I've sat through workshops on this material twice now, and still my comprehension is fairly shallow at the level of like fragments of like the technical stuff, plus like some vague metaphors about, or little toy stories about how it works. But I think I'm starting to get a better handle on at least the application side. So I think the two big boundary conditions for application, one is regulation and the other is cost. So let's talk about cost first. I think cost is a bit of a red herring. Like if it costs, what did he say, like 100,000 to 1,000,000 times more to verify a compute than to just repeat the compute, then it might seem silly. Why would you ever do this? Like, unless it's like less than a 1 ratio, why would you ever do this? Now, of course, there are cases where verifying is cheaper than doing the original compute, and that's kind of the definition of lots of NP-complete problems, like the Hamilton circuit. This was in one of the papers linked, and it's a classic example. Like verifying that you have a Hamilton circuit answer to a graph is much cheaper than actually finding a Hamilton circuit. So a Hamilton circuit is, you're given a graph and you need a circuit that goes through all the nodes. So finding one is obviously really hard computationally, but once you have one, you can just like list a series of nodes and anybody can like walk through and see that it does complete a circuit, right? So that's a less than one verification cost. And here they're talking of like, even in the best case scenario, it won't drop below 100x. But the reason I think this is a red herring is, if you look at data markets, and I just posted a link by my friend Abraham on like how those markets work, you realize that it's kind of a general thing that it's what's really valuable about data is in fact preventing other people from having it. And there's like systematic ways to think about it, right? And the easiest context is trading. So if you have some valuable information you can trade on, you should trade on it as long as possible. And if you trade, then the heat signature will be visible in sort of the stock market, and other people will guess that something is going on. And it's only a matter of time that enough information leaks that they can sort of like reconstruct what you're doing and then copy it. And pretty soon the edge is lost, and then there is no trade to be made, right? So in finance, that's pretty obvious. So the longer you can keep the information secret, the more value you can milk out of it. And the way to price a data asset then is sort of like a function of time. Like, it's very valuable to be in on it early enough, and definitely if you have like a trading strategy. So this is, I think, the way to think about the value of not just data, but the value of keeping other people from having data, which is what I think this technology is about, and the time sort of curve of that, because you cannot permanently keep anything secret and continue to use it. So this is kind of like it puts a hard sort of like floor on that, right? Like in the absolute mathematically hardest case, how long can you keep information secret? And in this case, it might be, in some cases, you can keep it secret for as long as the universe has existed if you use the ZK technology. So my point here is, it doesn't matter if it costs 100x or a million x to verify a compute, rather than sort of just share the data so anybody can repeat the compute. If the value in the time horizon of interest is a million times more, it's worth it, right? So this is the opposite use case of verifiability in research, where academic research, a lot of people are nowadays demanding open data standards. Like, if you use some data in your research and you publish the paper but not the data and how you actually did the computation, your research is no longer as credible. Like 15, 20 years ago, that would be fine, but today's standards to publish research, you have to publish the data as well. This is the opposite of that. Where academic research has a culture of the commons and data going out there. Therefore, I guess there might be academic cases where you would use technology like this to like claim, for example, that a vaccine is safe without revealing data. Or there's also obviously social science research where you anonymize participants without revealing who they are. But even there, by the way, there's research on like how do you like de-anonymize data and stuff. But the point is, there's a huge landscape and there's huge value to various kinds of data being kept anonymous. So that whole discussion is a little bit of a red herring. As far as like practicality goes, it's very practical to have extremely expensive to verify data. The only question is like finding the right data markets where the cost is worth it. So I think that part is easy. The government regulation stuff, I think, is the really hard part. Like the example in there somewhere was maybe you can do verifiable compute saying that you are keeping both sides of a transaction anonymous, but you're verifying that nobody on the OFAC list is involved in the transaction. I don't think this will fly, because traditional governments and states, even if they actually believe the mathematicians and scientists that the technology works, I think wanting to know who's involved and who's party to various transactions, it's it's not a restricted thing. Like it's more of a, I don't know, a very generic power and control thing where it's like they'll do as much as the law allows, and to the extent possible, they will push far beyond and like demand more. It's kind of like the logic of power is to demand as much visibility and access as possible. It's not going to stop at some boundary simply because the mathematicians say we can construct such a boundary. And you can already see that, like the degree to which intelligence agencies are fighting end-to-end encryption, right? And they don't have a particular reasoning behind it. They don't have a particular legal or like constitutional justification. It's just in the nature of intelligence agencies to want to like poke and pry everywhere. So there are extremely strong sort of like cultural forces in governance that make them extremely hostile to this kind of technology. So my sense is the real blocker for applying this technology is simply the hostility, the natural hostility of governments to this technology, which will be like vastly more than like regular blockchains. So regular blockchains are basically the opposite of anonymous. And even though governments are grumbling about it, fundamentally, once they understand it, I think the opposition kind of goes away because Bitcoin is more traceable than Havala, for example. But this stuff, I think it'll be like the strongest immune reaction ever. And I think getting this technology adopted where governments have an interest is the same thing as like inventing an alternative to the nation state. It's like post-nation state equivalent. So maybe that's a term we should be using. This is like mainstream ZK tech is post-Westphalian state equivalent. Like if you manage to do it, you'll have an alternative to the nation state as a government regime. So that's at least my belief. So I think the trick to making this technology as mainstream and powerful as possible is to find the application zone where the market and pricing dynamics are sort of like feasible. So it's worth paying 100x to millionx to transact in that anonymity, but the government simply doesn't have an interest. So I don't know what that particular set is. So you would like, I don't know, exclude things that the government might want to know, but everything else, it might work. So definitely a lot of like financial transaction data is out. But sort of like transaction data within an already verified pool. Now that might work. That already kind of works in insurance markets, right? Where it's illegal to discriminate, for example, on pre-existing conditions. So you qualify a large pool of health insurance applicants as a group, and then you say everybody must be given certain uniform financial treatment without regard to pre-existing conditions. And you can see that expanding right now. More and more people have genetic data, and you could presumably get extremely fine-grained with genetic data and insurance premiums for people. So people who are like genetically prone to a lot of big diseases, they would basically be charged $1 million in premium. So insurance would not be available to them. And obviously, in that case, the state has a big bias towards hiding the data from the people who would act on it. So there are cases where the economics and intents of governance kind of line up, and health insurance is the one I can think of. There may be other things. Like some examples I saw in the workshop were social proof type stuff. So for example, if you want to say that Anuraj and I are connected on the social graph by no more than 2 links, but you don't want to actually reveal those 2 links, like who can connect the chain between us. So let's say it's like a trusted secret chain of communication. Like I tell Nathan something, Nathan tells Jenna something, Jenna tells Anuraj something. So that's a chain where I can show that I have communicated certain information securely to Anuraj without revealing the links in between. Now that kind of thing might be possible. And in some cases, that might be sort of a valuable kind of dynamic to encourage, where you can say that this data has spread securely, or you can say that, like, say you're running like a very exclusive nightclub where everybody needs to know a password to get in, but the password is being passed around with like a friend of a friend along trusted chains of passing on, right? And you say that here are the 5 people who are sort of like the core of the party, and we want to invite 200 people, but with very trusted chains, but also in a way that nobody knows who invited who. So you have like a certain anonymity. I think you could pull things off like that, like a nightclub password where anybody who gets the password is known to be within some sort of like socially verified set, but you don't know exactly who invited them. So I can see applications for that sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, so exciting stuff. Uh, and I agree with the timeline of about 10 years where it'll get really interesting. So back to you, Anand.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so I sort of, maybe I can give some context on how I found this paper. So I first sort of heard of ZK Snarks when I sort of heard about the game, the Top Forest back in 2020, although I could never play it because it was very expensive at the time and I didn't have the technical expertise. But I recently got a chance to play some of the new games that the same team had built. And I mean, using snarks to verify and prove certain gameplay as part of the game, right? I thought that was interesting to see, like what I thought was like quite a research uh, end of the spectrum of development to have something in production. Although there is a lot of details to the systems that they use that I didn't quite grok yet, but that was interesting. And one of the things that that sort of the in the group chat that the sort of the game developers are chatting about, and I think one of the smart contract developer for the game that uses snarks in production today mentioned that writing smart contracts for physical actions, like just basically compute within the blockchain, but for other than money, symbolic things like money, identity, of governance, it seems a lot more fun. And those other gameplay actions, other than like money, identity, or governance, tend to be more compute intensive. So I can see sort of how, in order to sort of reduce to state compression or have some way of recursive proofs to really have like a low cost execution of those sophisticated gameplays within the game. And there is no oracle here. It is all within the sort of the blockchain environment itself. I thought that was interesting. And there was, I mean, again, I go back to sort of, I mean, the one more thing that reminded me was I was listening to a podcast on like the Lasso, Taylor's podcast on Lasso and explaining Jolt, which is the ZKVM. And I remember reading sometime last year, I think maybe the summer last year, about papers on Nova, Hypernova, Supernova. These are like different proof schemes, again, on the research end of the spectrums. But it seems Jolt has implemented some of those proof schemes in production within a year. I thought that was, and that allows for programs to be written in Rust and without having to worry about building your own circuits. And I mean, basically that compiles down to the circuits that's necessary to uh, run the compute, but programmers can write it in Rust. I thought that was in 1 year to go from a sort of leading edge proof system, recursive proof system, to having an implementation of it that allows for high level language instructions to be compiled. I thought that was quite fast, but maybe like everybody observed, maybe it'll take a lot more time for this thing to see like more commercial uses. But yeah, maybe I'll stop there and open up the floor for other discussions.
Something that Venkat was saying about, actually a lot of what Venkat was saying about the different applications potentially makes me feel like really this is like the barrier with government, sort of the government adoption is a lot of it is this question of who's my trust group. And currently governments control territories, and then to a certain extent the people within the territory they just sort of come along. And so the problem is, from a government perspective, not necessarily from the people actually living their lives perspective, that I don't necessarily trust everyone that I govern. One could imagine a world, and in some ways it is better, and in some ways it's pretty dystopian, where you use these sorts of things, governments use these sorts of things to establish better trust boundaries within the governed population. Who can I exclude? Who can I not exclude? Who's in my pool where I know you're not doing something with a sanctioned entity? And can I verify if you do, so I can kick you out of that pool? You could see an evolution of things, of course, where you start off with things like the insurance market, and you create that, but then that creates a certain legal precedent for, well, I have how am I trusting this particular group? And that precedent can grow over time. And I don't know how much this relates to the whole network states idea. I've never really read any of the network state stuff, but it does seem like there might be a path through these sorts of proofs to governments creating more of a trust boundaries around their populations and excluding people. And then the question is, what does that begin to then look like in the physical world? If I have been excluded from the trust boundary of my government, the governing entity of the territory, does that mean I have to leave the territory? Does that mean I'm an outlaw now in the original sense of the word? I'm outside of the law. That's an interesting set of things. And like, on the one hand, I could see where maybe if you're inside that trust boundary, things are suddenly a lot more utopian, but also outside the trust boundary, maybe it looks a little bit more like the purge. So yeah, so I don't know. And when Venkat was talking about that, that made me think of it's turning the governance problem from a question of making it's splitting the governance problem, where suddenly you have not only the governance of territory, but you have a trust boundary with people, which you didn't really have that before. And this is enabling that in a way that we haven't really seen. So just something I was thinking of while Venkat was talking.
So to add to that, Nathan, I think this is actually one of the areas where the application technology has evolved the furthest. So the Xerox PARC people introduced this sort of ticketing app called ZooPass a couple of events ago. So Anuraj and I both experienced it at DevConnect in Istanbul. So on the surface, it looks like just an event app in which you can hold tickets and also trading cards for games and things like that. But under the hood, it's basically ZK-based citizenship identifier stuff that's based on data that you own and control, as opposed to the government owns and controls about you. And they're sort of like slowly building on it. I just shared the link. Right now, the libraries they've released, you can kind of like build on top of the ZooPass system without knowing anything about ZK technology underneath. And they're using this as effectively kind of like virtual citizenship infrastructure across the original version was built at Zuzalu, which is kind of a pop-up city experiment. So in the network states, kind of like zone of experiments. And this year, Zuzalu has become Edge City. So there's one called Edge City Esmeralda that's going to happen in California in June, and then there'll be one in Thailand later this year. But all these are basically virtual pop-up cities, nation-type things. And even though they currently exist on top of traditional nations, they're using like identification and membership and inclusion-exclusion technology based on ZK. And the affordance is that it can be completely decentralized, where as a completely independent third-party developer, you can like use this library to write an app that verifies that somebody is an attendee at, say, Edge City, and then offer something else to them. Like, so in a way, how do I put it? It's like you don't need the permission of the organizers of Edge City in order to work with the population of Edge City. So it's almost like the baseline uh, trust boundary has been established by people buying or being invited to Edge City. It's an invite-only event. So that basic invite-only process is created like a minimum viable trust boundary. But within that, governance can be completely bottom-up, and it can have layers based on this. So yeah, I think this technology is basically here. And if you wanted to implement this in like, a patch of like terra nullis territory where no government has jurisdiction, you could build a state based on this kind of passport today.
Good luck finding Terra Nullis, though.
One thing that just came to my mind is like, how much of the government regulation is going to slow down the things. Uh, I think a couple of weeks ago, there's something called Wasabi Wallet, and then Tracer dropped the support for it because of some regulatory problems. I don't know. I didn't understand exactly what they do, but Wasabi Wallet basically I think, anonymizes the transactions, and Tracer had to stop the support for it. So as ZK systems are evolving, how much of the regulatory hurdles they will have to cross, that would be interesting to see.
Guess we're over a minute. Any last comments? Thanks everyone. If not, you can drop off. And we'll see you guys next week.